Hello everyone, nice to meet you. Before I say any more, I will start by playing a short video explaining what we're going to talk about today.
When you're using apps on your iPhone, you may start to see this. It's the new App Tracking Transparency prompt. It's a feature that gives you a choice. A choice on how apps use and share your data. Data like your age, location, health information, spending habits, and your browsing history, to name a few. This data can help to map your runs, tag your photos, or track your location so a nearby store can offer discounts. But some apps have trackers embedded in them that are taking more data than they need, sharing it with third parties like advertisers and data brokers. They collect thousands of pieces of information about you to create a digital profile that they sell to others. These third parties use your profile to target you with ads. And they can also use it to predict and influence your behaviors and decisions. This has been happening without your knowledge or permission. Your information is for sale. You have become the product. That's why iPhone users will now be asked a single, simple question. Allow apps to track you or not? Maybe you're okay giving an app your email or location so they can share your data with others to personalize ads or build a profile about you. And if you're not, well, that's what the prompt is for. Whatever you choose is up to you. But at Apple, we believe that you should have a choice. App Tracking Transparency, a simple new feature that puts your data back in your control.
So hi everyone, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really excited to do this presentation for you. And I mean, what better timing could I possibly wish for than the opportunity to do it the week that Apple releases their iOS 14 or 14.5 update. I mean, what we all strive for in marketing is the ability to hit the right people at the right time with the right message. And I gotta say, I really have the opportunity to do that now. I know that the title is a bit controversial. And I'm not just saying it to be sort of opposite of what everyone else thinks. I hope that in 30 minutes time, I will have shown you why I think it will be a good thing for our entire industry and for the digital advertising industry in general. And if not, well, yeah, then at least you've heard my opinion, and we can see along the way if I can change your mind. All right. So you've already seen the video now. I guess you know what it's about, what the fuss is about. Generally speaking, really short, to say it really shortly, the difference is now that people will be prompted to ask, to reply whether they would like to be tracked or not. So up until now, they've had the ability to just, we've had the ability to track them, whether they said yes or no. They had to personally go in and say no. Now it's the opposite way. They actively have to say yes in order for us to track them. That's like the short version of it. Of course, there are many other things happening, but this is the major change. This is the thing that will mean that you will see less conversions on your campaigns, and you will have harder times attributing your sales to the different types of campaigns you're running, the different platforms you're running, and so forth. But as I already said, relax. I actually think this is a good thing for us and for all of us. And when I say all of us, I mean not least consumers, of course, because there is a huge privacy issue about digital ads. But I also think it's a good thing for companies. And if I should sum it up in just one sentence, I think that it can make us focus on the right things. And when I say the right things, I mean things that create the biggest impact for brands and advertisers. Because truth of the matter is, that's rarely, if ever, short-term sales initiatives. And that's what I believe attribution drives. So what do you get when you can track every last detail after people see an ad? Well, you get short-term thinking. And so I think that's one of the places where this can make the biggest difference, that it can help us rebalance our attention from short-term campaigns to long-term campaigns. And it can help us refocus our efforts toward things that I believe drives much more growth for companies than short-term digital campaigns. All right, so just 1 minute about me. I'm not going to say much about this. I am the co-founder and CEO of a company called Deep Diver. We're a Danish company. We work with a range of the biggest clients in Denmark, companies and agencies, and are now expanding to other markets in Europe, such as Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland. And I think we already have part of the solution to this issue, because on our platform, you can merge data from all your different digital or social campaigns, and you can then see the conversions you get from in Google Analytics next to your campaigns in Facebook or LinkedIn or Snapchat or whatever it is. And that means that you can still track which campaigns are running and how they're impacting your sales, even without having the ability to track it like you could up until today. So I would like to talk a bit about attribution, because attribution is a huge factor in this. And basically what attribution is when I've scrolled on my phone through my Facebook feed, perhaps I've seen an ad, perhaps I clicked on it, perhaps I didn't, doesn't really matter. If I bought that product later on, that ad would be, or that sale would be attributed to the ad impression that I saw on my phone. So that's on a really general level, that's what attribution is. It's the ability to attribute conversions on your website to something that happens in your social feeds, to campaigns you see and ads you see. And from my perspective, there are just tons of things wrong with the way attribution works today. And so that's why I think it's good that iOS 14 limits the importance of attribution. So let me explain what it is I mean that's wrong with attribution today. So the first thing is, I've already said this, I'm going to say it more times during the next 35 minutes. It leads to short-term thinking. It makes us believe too much in the numbers. And I'm going to show you why I think the numbers can be wrong and misleading. It's heavily biased. And that means that the different platforms will always favor their own campaigns over other campaigns in the way they set up their attribution models. And frankly, I don't think it shows you the truth at all. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. But first of all, I would like to give you an example of what happens when you have access to too much data. What happens in your mind and what it does to the way you make decisions. So a while back, a psychology professor from the University of Oregon called Paul Slovich, he did a bunch of experiments. And what he researched was decision research and how we make decisions as humans. So what he did was he grouped the people who set odds for horse race betting. So the people who decides which horse is the favorite, which is the second favorite, and so forth. He grouped those people into 5 different groups. And one group had to set the odds on the races with based on just a few variables. So they didn't know that much about the horses. Perhaps they just knew how fast it ran yesterday and how many races it had won that year. They didn't know that much. The second group got 10 pieces of information. The second group got 20. Another group got 30. Another group got 40. So they had to do exactly the same task, which was predict who would win the race. But they had to do it based on a very different amount of data. And can you guess what happened? So what happened was that the people with just access to the few critical pieces of information, they were just as good at predicting the outcome of the race. They weren't any poorer at doing that than the people who had access to all the data in the world about the horses. But what was really interesting, and what was the biggest difference between these different groups, was that the groups that had access to a lot of data, they were so confident that they had made the right decision. They were perhaps a bit overconfident compared to their actual predictions. Whereas the group that just had access to a few pieces of information, they were much less confident that they had made the right odds but they had actually made quite good odds. So you can draw a straight line between the amount of data you have access to, in this case, and the prediction or the accuracy of the prediction. But you can draw a very different line between how confident you are that you have the ability to make the right decision. And so that's my first hope for this post iOS 14 social media marketing world. I hope that it releases us from a wrong, in my opinion, single source of truth mindset, where just because we have access to all the data in the world, or just because someone tells us exactly what's right, that we will stop believing that that necessarily is right, and we will start to use our own ability to think about things. Yeah. So as I already said, I believe that this change will help us focus a bit more on the long-term parameters. And let me explain to you why I think it's extremely important that we start doing that. So first of all, when I say long-term, obviously I'm talking about brand building. And I know that this is I don't want to say a touchy subject for growth hackers, but perhaps it is. But honestly, I believe that brand building should be a growth hacker's best friend. All right? It's the best way to generate better conversion rates, cheaper CPMs, more leads, better sales, higher efficiency and effectiveness of your marketing overall. So 2 professors, Peter Field and Les Binet, have done a lot of research on this topic. And they, a few years ago, released a quite interesting study that found what the difference is between a sales activation campaign on one hand and a brand building campaign on the other hand. So if you look at the yellow line, that represents sales activations. So whenever you do a campaign, you can see that your sales increase, right? And then it goes down again when the campaign ends. And you do a new campaign and your sale increase. And it stops and it goes down again. And that's how a sales activation campaign works. It generates a lot of sales, but it doesn't generate any long-term effects. You have to do it all over again. And obviously, when you are dealing with platforms with CPMs that increase, it makes it harder and harder every year to generate the same return from the same type of campaign. Now, when you do brand building campaigns, what you can see is that, on the short term, it doesn't generate as much sale as the sales activation campaign. But what it does drive is it lifts up your base sales. So you can see that it doesn't drive as high an increase. We're talking about the orange line here, but that new line is your new base sales. And that's generally speaking, of course, this is generally speaking, that's how it works. And that's why over time, we call it brand building, but what it really is just long-term sales campaigns. It's exactly the same. The focus is just on building a brand, building a mental presence so that consumers have an easier choice choosing you when they see you in your feed or when they see you in the local supermarket or whatever it is that you are selling to them. Or if you're not selling anything and you just want them to enroll them in your studies or whatever it is, it works the same way. A really interesting thing is that it works exactly the same way for B2B. B2B is not this hardcore performance type thing. The same rules generally apply in B2B. It still helps you convert users and get them over the line if you have a stronger brand. And so what they found, just as a general rule of thumb, is that you should spend more than half of your budget on brand building campaigns and less than half of your budget, 40%, on sales activation campaigns. And I promise you, that's not the split I see most often. And I work with, as I said, most of the big advertisers in Denmark at least. And of course, this is a general rule of thumb. If you are the category leader and you have a huge, well-known brand, well, you can spend even more on brand building and even less on sales activation because people will buy from you anyway. Whereas if you are a challenger brand or a small brand, of course, you need to do some more conversion-oriented campaigns and some more hardcore sales or registration or lead campaigns, whatever it is that your target is. So of course, it's not the holy grail 60-40 split, but it is quite important that we understand, or that we believe, that brand building will help a lot to do the same as what we want to achieve with our sales activation campaigns. And actually, the thing that impacts the effectiveness of our growth, or that impacts our growth the most is, no, sorry, I had another slide before, I'd forgotten about this. So when we talk about brand building, think of it this way. Every single impression your brand delivers, whether that's on TV, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Facebook or TikTok or whatever it is, it builds memory structures. So irrespective of the audience is aware or not, that means whether they know it or not, whether they remember it next week or not, it still builds memory structures. And every view of the brand's logo, sound, other types of assets builds salience and mental presence. And yes, sometimes when users see an ad, it might trigger them to go into a store or your website and actually buy your product. And that's what we recognize as the short-term sales impact. Of course, that happens as well in brand building campaigns. But as I already said before, one of the biggest things you can do to make sure that you grow more than your competitors is, it sounds a bit basic, but it is to spend more money. There's a quite strong evidence to support that if you spend a relatively higher percentage of your budget compared to your competitors, compared to your market share, you are more inclined to grow. Whereas if you spend relatively less than your competitors, you're more inclined to not grow, to actually shrink. So all the specialists out there, this piece of research that is done, that's what you should show them, because that's what tells them that, yes, you need to invest in marketing, you need to spend a lot of money on ads. That's one of the ways that you can actually grow your business. So when we talk about spending a lot of money on ads, what is it then that you should focus on, or what is it that's in your control that you can actually do to make it more effective? Well, the very thing that you can do, besides being big already, to increase the effectiveness of your ads, that's the quality of your creative work. So this is a place where you're never allowed to not do the very best you can do, because this is a place where you can make the very biggest impact. All right. Other things that are really important is your budget setting, whether that's across geographies, if you work in multiple countries, or if you work across multiple products or whatever it is, that's really important. One of the things that isn't important though is targeting. You can see that's in the very bottom of the profitability multiplier, which means that you can't really multiply your returns that much by being better at targeting. And so the reason for this is that we as marketeers, we like to make personas. We like to target very specific buyers who have this specific criteria and this age and whatever. But that's not how the normal distribution looks from a normal user perspective. So where by far the most users is in the 0 to 2 purchases a year category. I mean, I know I'm talking about purchases a year based on different types of products. I can't do that, of course. In this example, which is a Coca-Cola example, you can see here below that this figure represents the percentage of buyers. And this line here represents how many times a year they buy a Coke bottle. So what you can see here is that they have about 60% of their users, consumers, they buy 1 to 2, perhaps 3 Coke bottles a year. That's by far the vast majority of their sales, compared to increasing loyalty by having people who already buy Coke bottles every week buy one more. That's so few people we're talking about here. So the biggest opportunity for growth is to reach as many people in a category as you can. That's why targeting isn't a big profitability multiplier. You can agree with me on this or disagree with me on this. I would say that the science is quite clear here, that you can really grow if you create high quality creative and you try and target quite a lot of people, and you have a long-term strategy for your brand. All right, so that's my second hope. I hope that it will bring back focus on the long term. I think that's something we've neglected quite a lot. So the third thing I want to talk about is our ability to think about what the numbers actually tells us. All right? Because I think we have a tendency of trusting the numbers too much. Let me give you an example here. I know I'm going to be perhaps a bit nerdy just for a minute or so. I hope that's okay. I hope you'll stick by here. I don't know if you know about the difference between correlation and causation, or whether you know what it is. Basically, what it means is when two things correlate, it means that they change in a similar way. So if one go up, the other goes up, or if one go up, the other goes down. Whatever it is, they change in similar patterns. That's what correlation means. Causation, on the other hand, means that one thing changes and that directly impacts another thing. So the second thing changes because of the first thing. So do you see the difference here? Just because two things happen at the same time, it doesn't mean that one of them happens because of the other one, right? And so just to give you a few examples of things that correlate really well, but obviously have no connection whatsoever, right? There's a clear correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and the films Nicolas Cage appeared in. I mean, I know you can see there's no direct impact here unless you really hate Nicolas Cage, which I know some people do. You can see that this is just two things that happen at the same time, but are not connected at all. Could also be how much cheese a country eats and how many people dies by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. I mean, I understand that if you get really overweight, perhaps you're more inclined to get tangled in your bed sheet. But I guess you can agree with me here that these things are just things that happen at the same time. They have nothing to do with each other, right? So why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this to make it very clear that it's the same with attribution, right? Just because I see something on my phone, perhaps I don't even see it, perhaps it's just there for a second without sound, and I later buy something, it doesn't mean that I buy it because I saw it on my phone. It could very well be that it just happened to happen at the same time, especially if I reach a lot of people. And that's why I think it's really important to be critical about what attribution here really means. It just means that I saw something or I clicked on something and I later bought it. It doesn't mean that it happened because I did the first thing. It's quite important to understand here. Okay, so going back to where I was, which is here. Yeah, so I hope, again, that we will start using our critical thinking ability and really understand what these numbers mean and why they're presented to us like they are. Because that's the next thing here. I hope that we will focus less on attribution and more on the big picture, and I'm going to show you why now. I think attribution is heavily biased. I've already told you that. Let me explain why that is and how it works on the different platforms, because I think that's quite important to understand when you evaluate the success of your campaigns. So in Google and in Google Analytics, when you see which campaigns generated your revenue or which platforms, generated your revenue, Google will always base it on a last touch attribution model. So that means that doesn't matter what happened before. All that matters to Google is what's the last thing you did before you bought something. And what do you think the last thing people do before they buy something online is? Well, they Google it. Doesn't matter if you've seen it 100 times on TV, 100 times on Facebook and on Snapchat, and have done all sorts of things, and you've liked their Facebook, followed their Instagram profile for 15 years. All that matters to Google is, what did you do? What is the last thing you did before you bought it? And a lot of times that is you Googled it to find it, to buy it. So Google's own attribution model heavily favors Google's own products. I think it's quite important to be aware of. So let's move to the next platform, Facebook. Well, Facebook is good at reaching a lot of people. When I say Facebook, I mean Facebook and Instagram, of course, an audience network and Messenger. not WhatsApp yet, but let's see. So Facebook's attribution model up until today didn't only look at whether you clicked on something and bought it. It also took into account whether you just saw something. So if you just saw, perhaps you didn't even see it, perhaps it was just on your screen. So if you just saw something, that could be counted as a reason that you ended up buying the product. And of course, that makes sense. We all know that you don't have to click on something and like it to actually end up buying it or downloading the book or whatever it is that you need to do. It can just as easily be that you just watch a video or just see an ad and do something. So of course it makes sense that it should have some relevance, but it also makes a lot of sense for Facebook because Facebook can reach basically all people in a country in a very short period of time. And that means that all the buys they get online would be attributed to Facebook, or partly to Facebook at least. But I would say Facebook isn't the worst here. I think their balance was actually quite good. If you look at LinkedIn, LinkedIn's default attribution window is 7 days after you watch something and a month after you click on something. So if I clicked on something 28 days ago and I buy it, that will be attributed to the LinkedIn ad I saw. If I just was presented to something on LinkedIn 6 days ago, I didn't do anything and now I buy the product, that will also be attributed to LinkedIn. But LinkedIn isn't the worst one here, if I can call it the worst one. The worst one by far is Twitter. Do you know what you can set the attribution window to on Twitter? You can set it to 90 days, so that's 3 months. And you don't even have to engage with it. You don't have to watch the video. You don't have to click on anything. You don't have to reply to a tweet or favorite it or retweet it or anything. If you're just being presented to something on Twitter 2.5 months ago and you end up buying it, that purchase will be attributed to the Twitter ad that you perhaps saw or didn't see. And I mean, that's not fair at all. That it doesn't make any sense, to me at least. So I understand if you don't think it's fair or if you're confused that there are all of these different attributions models, but I just think it's so important that you understand what they mean and why you're being presented to them, because they all try to favor themselves. Now, just to give you a normal example here, I'm on the train on my way to work. I see an ad on Facebook and I'm on my phone and I think it looks interesting. Perhaps I click on it, perhaps I don't. But I go to the website on my phone, but I don't buy the product. I leave it again. So later that day on my computer, I Google the product and now I buy the product. So do you think Facebook should get credit for that sale? I think so. Do you think Google should get credit for that sale? I actually don't think so. I mean, yes, I found the website via a Google search, but Google didn't impact the sale that I actually did. But if I was looking at this in Google Analytics, Google would get all the credit, Facebook would get 0 credit. So it is really hard to find the right things here. And I'm not saying I have exactly the right answer. I'm just letting you know that I think it's really, really important that you keep your own sanity and you check how they actually do this attribution. Because chances are they will do it in a way that makes themselves look good, which is fine. I mean, we also all want to look good for our bosses or superiors or whoever it is. But at least ourselves, we should know that whether it's actually the truth or whether we can do other things that would drive more sales. Okay. And so the last thing I want to talk about here about attribution is it doesn't take any previous experience into account. I would like to show you an example of this. And right after I've done this, I would like to show you how I think you should then measure your performance on social media. Do you know the case of Tropicana? Well, it's a bit old. It's from 2009. And perhaps it started in 2008 or 2007. So what happened was Tropicana is a very famous juice brand. And in the US, they decided to do a repackaging and a rebranding. So they changed from the look you see on the left of the screen to the look you see in the right side of the screen. And this is a campaign that they had spent $35 million on. making this change, and it happened in January. Do you know what happened? Their sales dropped by 20%. 20%. That's a huge decrease. Why would their sale drop 20% in a period where they're heavily advertising on all platforms? Well, it happened because consumers couldn't recognize the packaging. So when they were in store buying a product, they couldn't find Tropicana, so they just chose something else. And I think this really and by the way, only a month and a half later, they drew back their repackaging and changed it back to the old one. But I think this really tells us something about the power of fame and the power of something we already know. And I think attention or a knowledge, awareness about something is so much higher when it's something attention is so much higher when it's something we already know. We're much more inclined to do something if it's something we trust, and we trust something more if we know it better. And so that's the reason that Sillet Bang keeps on going, Sillet Bang, Sillet Bang, Sillet Bang in all their ads. They don't care whether you like the ads or not. They just want you to become familiar with the concept of Sillet Bang, so that when you shop for cleaning products, you're more inclined to choose Sillet Bang because you already know this product compared to something else that you don't know. And so I think going back to attribution, I hope that we will focus less on this and more on the big picture, because I hope that you agree with me that obviously what I know of a brand and the experiences that I've had with a brand in 10 years, that should matter much more than what ad I saw in my feed yesterday when I evaluate what's actually successful and what helps drive my performance further on. But I know that this can be really tricky, and I totally acknowledge that it's easy for me to say you shouldn't look at attribution, you shouldn't look at what campaign drove which sale, because of course you would like to evaluate the performance of your campaigns. It makes sense. What I would like to say though is that I think it's really sad if we stop doing things that we believe in just because we can't measure them, and we keep on doing things that we don't really believe in just because it looks good in the numbers. So I'd like to present to you how I would look at measuring campaigns from social media. And I know this can look different than what others would do. This is how I would do it. And I see perhaps 100 different ad accounts on different platforms every week when I speak to our clients and potential clients. So I do know quite a bit about how people usually optimize. And it's quite often the same things that I would look at or I would change. So now I'm going to tell you how I look at these things. First of all, this measurement framework is based on two things. It's quite simple. It's not something overly complicated. I'm sure you can get it in just a minute what I mean. But it's based on the sales cycle of the brand or the product. It doesn't have to be sales. Again, it can be a university, and how often people would have to do this thing that you want them to do. And then the funnel stage. So when I say sales cycle, I mean, are you a car manufacturer or are you an insurance company where it takes a long time for people to decide and do something? Perhaps it takes 6 months, perhaps it takes more. Or are you a Coke brand, a toothpaste brand, milk, whatever stuff you do in an instant like that? Are you Zalando or whatever? And you have a really short sales cycle. Then of course you should measure the success of your campaigns in a different way. That's the one parameter. Obviously the other important parameter is the objective of the campaign. So is this a top funnel campaign? Is it going to drive awareness and attention to your brand? Is it a mid-funnel campaign where you're trying to drive some more interest, perhaps you're trying to drive some more engagement in a way? Or is it a low-funnel campaign? I mean, are you going to try and drive people over the line, push people over the line, which is what you want to do in low-funnel campaigns, of course. And so that leaves us with these 4 different options of what stage is it in the funnel, what's then the goal, what social metrics should you then look at, and again, I'm saying this subjectively from my past experience, and then what other KPI should you measure this based on, if not just the social KPI. So first of all, if we look at the top funnel, Well, the objective of a top funnel campaign is to drive awareness. How do you do that in a social platform? Well, you need to reach people in order to have the chance of converting them. You do. And when you reach people, you need to look at how much you're paying for the impressions and, of course, your frequency and other things. But you should try and find places where you can reach people effectively and quite cheaply. And, of course, the optimal goal that you want to drive in the awareness phase is that people remember you. And you do that by looking at ad recall metrics or brand lift studies or other things. And this is by far the trickiest stage to measure. I totally acknowledge it. I acknowledge it if many of you out there and if many of your employees or bosses don't think it's good to measure stuff based on reach. But I gotta say, it actually works, right? You need to reach people in order to have any chance of converting them. And by the way, the reason I'm not using rates here or costs is it's easy to have a good conversion rate or engagement rate. It doesn't say anything about the growth of your business, because then you just need to reach 5 people, have one of them convert. You have an excellent conversion rate, but you haven't driven any business whatsoever. So this is the top funnel. So moving down into the mid funnel here. By the way, the top and the mid funnel are quite similar, whether you have a long-term sales or short-term sales cycle. The goal here is to drive interest. How do you drive interest? Well, you look at qualified traffic. So when I say qualified traffic, I mean traffic that doesn't bounce, traffic that somehow sticks on your website, if that's a goal, or leads, if that's what you want to drive. Or again, if you're not into the web thing and you're a Coke or whatever, perhaps you would look at what's the time that you can have people watch your videos. Do they watch them for 2 minutes? Do they watch them for 40 seconds? Do they watch them for 5 seconds? And then that would be your goal. But your overall KPI here in the mid stage, from my perspective, that you can measure, we're talking about stuff that you can measure for free and that everyone can measure, right? I'm not talking about huge qualitative studies that you can buy and have people do for you. I would look at session duration. Do you find that you're generating more interest to people? That's basically what I mean by session duration. Or you could look at Google Trends. Can I see an uplift in how many people that are actually searching for me? And I'll get back to that in the low funnel, because I think that's where a lot of the gold is hidden, when we not only look at the social metrics. So if we're moving into the low funnel with a short sales cycle, the goal is to drive an action. That can be a purchase, it can be a registration. You would still measure that based on purchases. I mean, there's not really much fuss here. I guess that's quite clear to everyone why you would do that. But if you have a long sales cycle, and you are in the action-oriented campaign, I mean, how the hell do you measure that people will do something that they will end up doing in 6 months or 9 months? That's why a lot of car makers, they would measure stuff based on, do I want to book a test drive or something? But when you book a test drive, you're already quite close to choosing that car. So that's not a good metric to measure it on. So when you are in the low phase, and you have a long sales cycle, I would look at on social platforms, I would look at brand awareness to get people to actually see it, acknowledge it, and remember it. But then as the main KPI, as the leading KPI for me, that would be share of search. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of share of search, but it's a really powerful KPI, and it's something that's on the rise quite a lot. So I will explain to you what it is, because again, it's free and it's easy to do, and it's a really, really, really good indicator of future growth. So this is an example of how share of search fits well with later shifts in market share. So you can see here that the blue line that you see here, the first one, that's when your searches peak. And then the orange line is then, how does that then correlate later on with my market share? And I think you can see a quite clear trend that when people search for something, and when more people start searching for you than your competitors, it will usually follow that they will end up buying you over others. So just to sum it up here in the share of search part, looking at organic searches, that's a really, really powerful way of looking at campaign effectiveness. It's unbiased. It's just based on people's own searches when they think they're alone and no one's watching. We are not watching them, of course. It's just an aggregate. It's free and it's instant. And yes, I get the point that you can say that it's hard to measure one social campaign and see a change in your share of search. That's true. But then I would debate whether you should do that social campaign or not. Whether you should pool your money and do a bigger campaign. Whether you should do something else entirely. Because if you can't measure it anywhere, what's it really worth doing in the first place? I mean, if you can't measure any change anywhere. So the final, I'm calling it a KPI framework. I know that's a bit of a stretch to call it that. Looks like this. We have the top stage, the mid stage, mid funnel, and we have the two low funnels. And we have a goal, we have a social metric, and we have the other, or the most important KPI in this stage. So that was it for me. Oh, I stopped sharing too early. I hope you found it interesting. My name is Kristoffer. You can always write to me on this email if you have any questions to the stuff I've presented. If you disagree or agree, you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn with the below tag that I wrote here. And otherwise, I would end this part by just saying that I think we should all relax. I think when we find out that iOS 14 didn't change the number of sales we did after all, we made it a bit harder to measure it on Facebook. Sure, that's annoying as hell for specialists who do the optimization. But I really think that it can mean that we can open our eyes and look at other things that I think will drive a much better performance than these short-term, low-funnel campaigns that happens too frequently, at least in my opinion. Yeah, so thank you all very much. I see that we have the first question here from Aditya. The question is, in general, how much ASO is going to be affected with iOS 14? Personally, I don't know what ASO means, so perhaps you can follow up and write it here, and I will try to answer that. Also, you told that brand building must have higher budget. Does it work for mobile apps, games? That means, is it better to build your brand first than launching the product? I think that's an excellent question. I think it's hard to give an easy answer, but what I would say is that no, I'm not saying you should build your product before you launch the product. I understand that you would like to get it out there. You would like to get feedback on the game. I'm just saying that if people feel that they recognize the game or recognize you when they see an ad for it, it's so much more likely that they will end up downloading the game or buying the game, whether it's free or paid. I mean, the amount of competition in the games space, whether that's in App Store or Google Play or in the social feeds, that's just immense. So I think the way you can really stand out there is to make sure that people actually know you. I mean, the good thing about gaming is that brand building in games is quite close to a product campaign, I would say. Because we're not talking about the developer of the game when we talk about brand building. We're just talking about doing campaigns that really show the games in a really good way without focusing all the time on optimizing for most amount of downloads. Because I think then you would reach too few people. That's at least my experience. I hope this answered the question. Perfect. Well, I don't see any more questions here, but thanks a lot for listening to me. I hope you found it useful, and I hope to see you someday on another conference, and have a nice day.